Okay, so just to reiterate, the first part of the session is going to be recorded, but the Q&A session isn't going to be. We will remember to turn the recording off at that point. If you have a point of clarification during the time we're talking, if you could just put something in the chat, and one of us will hopefully try and pick that up. But if you want to reserve any questions until the end, what we'd like to do at that point then is to invite you to ask your question in person. So if you want to turn your audio on or your camera, please feel free to do so at that point. Thanks very much. So Anthony and I, you were introduced to Anthony earlier. Anthony and I are going to be looking at new ways of addressing children's needs, uniting Bayesian analysis, big data, pro-Article 12 ways of working to support children in conflict with the law. When Anthony was introduced earlier on, he made reference to the fact that he's part of the Innovative Youth Justice team in Swansea. Though I come from Cardiff, I'm also part of that team, having done my PhD at Swansea. So when you think about Article 12, and we've helpfully put that on the screen for you, big data probably isn't the thing that immediately springs to mind. What we tend to think about instead is actually more participatory methods and the qualitative approaches which enable the child's voice to be heard. However, what we're going to do today is reflecting the fact that we're perhaps both at opposite ends of the spectrum, from the qual and the quant side, is we'd like to be able to demonstrate some ways in which both of our work can actually enhance and strengthen the evidence base around how we can best support children who've come into conflict with the law. So I'm going to largely draw on my doctoral thesis, which used data from the risk assessment process that's used in the youth justice system across England and Wales. And I'm going to be demonstrating the utility of Bayesian approaches in criminology. So don't worry, I'm not going to give you a stats lecture. I'm very clear, I won't be giving a stats lecture, but I'm going to be discussing some of the findings. So if we could move on to the next slide for me, please, Anthony. So criminology has very much got this positivist approach, and that's actually quite a flawed methodological approach. The dominant paradigm in youth justice for a long time has been risk factor research, RFR. And this is very much embedded in what is the best of positive ideas and an attempt to reduce human behaviour to a set of rules and measures. So what you end up with is almost a one-size-fits-all approach. Some of the criticisms of RFR are included on the slide. And so you've got issues around whether or not key measures have been homogenized. So when you're thinking about offending, does that mean all offending, or are you looking at different offence types or different typologies of a criminal career? There's been a dominance of a single study, which has not been replicated. We tend to think in terms of causation and correlation rather than causation. And we've had a very reductionist approach, which has led to oversimplification. It could also be argued that by purists that we've not been appropriately applying statistical techniques. And we had some confusion about what is actually being predicted in risk factor research. Is it offending? Is it reoffending? Or is it actually reconviction? So the starting point for my research was this, and it's a book written by Kevin Haynes and Steve Case, which some of you may be familiar with. Hold it up on the screen. And they go into a lot of detail critiquing the situation. At the time that we had what we refer to perhaps as the modern youth justice system being created in England and Wales, there was that significant emphasis being placed on risk. And this has been articulated in the risk assessment tool, which was developed to coincide with the start of the new youth offending teams coming into being in 2000. And in the decade that followed, what we're seeing is net widening and the development of recipes of innovations. For those of you who are familiar with the tool, what I'm referring to is ASSET, and it has been heavily criticised by both practitioners and researchers alike, and it's since been replaced by ASSET Plus. But let me just summarise momentarily, for those of you who are not familiar with it, what's been happening internationally and across England and Wales in terms of risk assessment tools. So Anthony, if you could just move on for me. So the work around risk assessment, both in the adult and youth justice system, has been led by Andrews and Bonta. And what they've identified is a series of different generations of tools. they've used different types of information to inform the decision and scope. So what we've really seen is a shift away from professional judgment to using tables or tools. And these are essentially lookup tables. There's been more emphasis on the potential for what can be changed. So we've moved beyond static to perhaps what we might refer to as dynamic factors. And we've also started to move more away from looking purely at reoffending to also consider case management. Next slide, please. In terms of the situation in England and Wales, I mentioned that ASSET is a standardised risk assessment tool that was developed to coincide with the introduction of the yachts in 2000. And it's based on this framework of risk and protective factors. There's two versions of ASSET, core and final warning. So what essentially final warning is like ASSET light, and it wasn't used in full for those involved in less serious offending. But at the heart of this were a series of practitioner-based scores relating to 12 domains of risk. From 2009, under the scaled approach, these became more closely aligned to the nature and intensity of revision, and you started to have people categorised on the basis of their risk score as being high, medium or low, and linked to that with the number of sessions of supervision that they were required to have. The Ministry of Justice reviewed ASSET as a result of all the criticism, with the report being published in December 2011. However, it wasn't until autumn 2015 that we actually saw the rollout of ASSET Plus. And this has seen a lot more emphasis on desistance. It's seen as a living document, and it's seen the removal of ASSET scores. I will say that ASSET Plus is not completely loved by practitioners, but we're only now starting to see that reflected in journal articles. Thinking about big data, an awful lot of administrative data is actually collected within the youth justice system, but it's not necessarily in the most accessible format for research purposes. When we think about disciplines such as social care and criminology, that kind of data is far from perfect. So it includes information about dates, measures, outcomes of progress, but it's also likely to include subjective ratings from practitioners, which could include subconscious bias. And the information may not necessarily be completely reliable. And what I mean by that is that when we're talking about systems where telling the truth could actually get you into more trouble, there's a disincentive to actually be truthful. There's also a lot of concerns in terms of big data around data security. So there's currently the debate going on at the moment in England about the sharing of GP records with NHS Digital, whilst the What Works Centre for Social Care has considered the ethical uses of big data and machine learning approaches in children's social care systems. And for me, these are really valid debates which highlight the genuine issues around governance. But that doesn't mean that big data isn't very powerful. Next slide, please. Big data has been hailed as a panacea. But in the context of youth justice, I think that there's some significant challenges. So we have a system where we're now recognising that one size doesn't fit all. And we've also got an existing evidence base that's been challenged. And this is great because it's led to new research. However, there's still gaps in that. At the same time, what we've seen is a change in the views of children, as emphasised by the very fact that this conference is all about children's rights. But we've also particularly seen the ACEs agenda come to the fore. There's also growing awareness from the Edinburgh study about the risks around usual suspects and the impacts of system contact. So data can be really great for helping with that. And there's an awful lot that we can learn. However, when we're talking about youth justice, we've also got problems where some groups are overrepresented and underrepresented in the criminal justice system. And that if you start to rely on big data and machine learning and go through that process blindly, what you end up is a situation that they've had in policing and predictive policing that has had. We've seen this mainly on the other side of the Atlantic, but I have seen it in this country as well, where the injustice, historic injustice, has been amplified by approaches to predict policing because they relied blindly on the data. We also have the low frequency in youth justice of certain types of offending. We've got a system that is contracting, so we've got fewer first-time entrants as a result of increased diversion. But the ones that are left in the system are increasingly complex. And there's been also in recent years, particularly in response to COVID, actually, we've seen the shift in the nature of crime and emerging crime types. So when you're thinking about using essentially historic big data, it's the thing you need to take into account these things. So I'm proposing that we use Bayesian approaches. So I appreciate many of you have not come across this term before. Essentially, it's just an alternative form of probability to the one that you were taught in schools. It's been around for about 250 years. And where it's started to become increasingly popular, I've got some examples of uses on a following slide, but it's the fact that data is now being collected more systematically using computers, and the fact that we do have computers, which makes the maths a lot more easy to kind of tackle, which means that we're now starting to see an increase in popularity. So at the time when I was doing my research, it's accepted in medicine, physics, engineering, ecology, archaeology, and economics, but it's still not quite novel, particularly in the social sciences and especially criminology. So just to explain a little bit about where Bayesian comes from, Bayes' theorem is quoted on the slide. And essentially what you're doing is you're taking your prior probability. And what I mean by that is the probability of an event happening before new data is collected. And this can be the best rational assessment of the probability based on what you already know. And the posterior probability is when you've revised that based on having new information come to light. So it's considered to be a lot more intuitive as a result of this. So, and probably one of the best examples is to think about almost a criminal trial. And you have an initial impression when you see the defendant in the dock, but as you're given new evidence, you can make your own decision on whether the defendant is guilty or innocent, depending on what weight you place on that evidence as it comes up. And that's what it's referring to in the likelihood. You may change your opinion during the course of a trial, or it may strengthen your conviction of the innocence or guilt of the defendant. Next slide, please. So in terms of why I'm promoting Bayesian approaches, they allow you to do a lot more with less in terms of data. So they're great when you've got low base rates, so very small numbers, and they're not restricted to having minimum sample sizes or cell sizes. And that's when you compare them to traditional approaches where, for example, you need at least 30 or you needed at least 5 in a cell to be able to carry out certain tests. You're not restricted by those rules. The approach also allows more variables to be added to a model, which means that you've got more flexibility. Under traditional approaches, what you'd need to do if you wanted to add a new variable is actually start from scratch. However, a Bayesian approach allows you to continue to add to models. So if new information becomes available, you can add it to the model. And as I said, it tends to be more intuitive. So the more evidence we get, or the stronger our belief in something, the more weight we can put on that when we come to decide our decision. So first of all, I should just say, don't panic. You're actually using Bayesian, but you probably don't realize it. It's actually the kind of algorithm that underpins the likes of Google, Amazon, Netflix. And when you start doing, for example, predictive text, or you're trying to see what film you should watch next, it actually bases that on what you have previously asked about or searched for, and what others with the same tastes have also looked for. And that's using that information about the likelihood to create the prior. It's also used when thinking about insurance and determining the risk of lending money to potential borrowers based on certain characteristics. And notably, it's been used, it's been in the media quite a bit more recently because scientists have used it in medicine to help with COVID-19. So if you want to know a bit more about Bayesian, before I rattle off too much and get really statty, I've got some examples there. One uses Lego to help you to understand Bayes' theorem, and the other one is based on Star Wars, so it's just a bit of fun. The other one also gives some worked examples. So we'll be sharing the slides later on and explain a little bit more. So in terms of how I use Bayesian approaches in my PhD, what I did was to create a series of multi-level models, or hierarchical modeling as we call it in the Bayesian world, to create models which resemble the way in which asset operated in practice. So under asset, you had domain scores across 12 domains, and they were added up to give a total score. So I've used an additive model. We have a series of domain scores which have the potential to vary over time. I think I need the Teletubby version. That's fine. Lego, read the Lego one. Sorry, reference to Kathy. So we also have variables which are fixed. So slightly controversial, you are born with a particular sex. In the very, very minority of cases that might change, but we generally consider sex to be something that's fixed. Ethnicity tends to be fixed. The age at which you first committed an offence is also fixed. That can't change. So there are also variables which reflect the individual's criminal career. And I've created flags which represent kind of events linked to the administration of justice. So this might be that you have breached, or you've been remanded, or you've been returned to court, or spent time in custody. And I've created flags which say that that event happened between assessments. I was interested in the outcome of further offending behaviour rather than reoffending. And this goes back to one of the criticisms of risk factor research, where reoffending, what we really are talking about is actually reconviction. And it's an administrative measure, depending on the outcome after a certain period of time, whether or not it went back to court or not. So further offending is more linked to the time at which the offence occurred. And we can relate that to events that are then going on which change the risk scores for the individual. I used data from a single local authority, and in total I had 545 assets or observations relating to 87 individuals who are in the formal youth justice system. So this didn't include any diversionary cases. Looking at this now, it seems quite historic to be thinking in terms of the data from 2012-13 and 2013-14. This is a reflection of the fact that we needed to wait at least 18 months to be able to see originally if someone had reoffended. So in terms of some of the quick findings, this is the way that I tended to think in terms of how the scores could be presented. So this is the average score for all 87 individuals in each of the 12 domains in terms of their opening assets. And you can see that they tend to be around 1, 2. So they're not particularly high. They're suggesting a moderate but definite association between the domain score and reoffending. And these may relate to some offending, but not all. And they tend to be related to each other more than necessarily be considered in isolation. So having looked at the opening asset scores for everyone, I then compared them. And this is what you can see on this next chart. So what you've got in green are those that are have had experience of care, so have been or are currently looked after children compared to their peers. So at time 0, so this is just after they've offended and at the time of their initial assessment, there are significant differences in the average domain scores for family and personal relationships, which is just here. I hope you can see my cursor moving on the screen. And also for emotional and mental health. We tend not to think in terms of p-values. So on the screen, you've actually got the Bayes factor, what is called a Bayes factor, but it's very similar to a p-value. If it's over 3, it suggests that there is evidence, and the strength of that evidence is then reflected by increasing scores. So really, we're looking for a very high score in favour of the alternative hypothesis. There's also no statistically significant difference in the scores for neighbourhood, lifestyle, substance use, and physical health. Okay, so there's lots of explanations for why that might be occurring, particularly if you know a lot about the kind of background of the young people who have experience of care. What was significant is that when I looked at the differences based on their opening scores, there was a difference in the odds ratio. So those with experience of care were 1.7 times more likely to have offended than their peers. This was the bit that got really exciting for me, and I will confess now to being completely geeky about this. So I fixed the scores. So I recreated what the output from my models was showing. I fixed the scores, so I put them so that they were all 4, all 2, all 1, etc. And that's what's shown on the lower chart there. And as you'd expect, by working with the Youth Offending Service in the time after they've committed that initial offence, if nothing else happens, you should see a reduction tending to 0. If you do repeat the exercise looking at those that have been in care compared to their peers, and that's the chart on the right-hand side, what you see is that those two lines never overlap, they never cross. And actually, you can see that over time, there is always the probability of further offending for those that have been in care remains so much higher than for those that have not been in care. And this is a really crucial finding for me. I've repeated this for a number of different sub-cohorts. I'm not going to go into this in too much depth, but this for me showed that my approach worked, and that was the key thing. So you can move to the next slide. So as you've seen from the chart, those with experience of care tend to have a higher risk of further offending relative to those that have never been looked after, and that continues over time. So that's the green compared to the red chart. And you can see and imagine that actually other factors have the same, when you put them on the same chart, they have the same effect. So age at first offence, gender, there's a penalty for being female there, ethnicity, the type of offence that's being committed as the index offence. And you can also start seeing where events start to change as well. And the easiest way to describe this is that instead of having that nice curve, is that you'll have spikes. And the probability of further offending will spike as a result of an event happening. And this links into the academic literature in terms of their idea that perhaps if someone knows, for example, that they're going to return to court, there can be an all or nothing approach. So some will knuckle down and be incredibly remorseful, and that'll be reflected across all their domain scores. So essentially they are presenting themselves at court as almost a redeemed character in the hope of a lighter sentence. But there also might be some that recognizing that this could be a negative outcome, visiting court could be a negative outcome, just blow it. I'm just going to go out, I'm going to have fun with my mates, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And you would see the risk score increase there. You're probably thinking, so what? We already know all this. Well, this research provides the building blocks for further work, which takes a more intersectional approach. And we can also explore the impact of these events, these changes in circumstances, a lot more. We can also expand the list of personal characteristics, and these can be fixed or they can be time varying. And what I mean by time varying is actually that you might find someone has a new diagnosis or they start treatment at a certain point during the time that they're under the supervision of the yacht. So we can say at what time that event started, and assuming it's an enduring characteristic, I hate to use the phrase applying a label, but we can actually add that to the menu of characteristics that they have. So we can also consider differences and it's one of the areas I didn't look at, is around the index offence or also specific interventions. So the work that I'm starting to do now is building on my doctoral work, linking the data from the Youth Offending Service to the individual's health, education and social services to find out more. But going back to the reason that we wanted to do this workshop, the data on its own can only tell us so much. So I want to just bring up the next slide, which is thinking about the knowledge iceberg. So if you could just leave it there for a moment, Anthony. Don't rush ahead. Sorry. So there could be things above the surface. First click, please. And this is the things that most people know. And there's also things that, a little like a spotter on a boat, people know to look out for. And this might be things that practitioners or those working with young people start to know to look for. Okay, so not obvious to everyone, but start to know to look for. And that's where I think my research is possibly doing that, or at least my doctoral research is doing that. Below the surface, we can click on one more time, are the things that we really do need to know. And we can click on again, those that we don't yet realise that we need to know. Deep below the surface, we can click on one more time, there are also things that we have to accept there are things we may never know. And there's also the great unknown, which is deep. And quite frankly, we just never need to concern ourselves with that. Why am I mentioning the knowledge iceberg? Well, I think that the methods that I've tested as part of my PhD will help us to look more about those things that are just below the surface. So if you could move on to that next slide, please. One particular issue is this idea that one size doesn't fit all. So in recent years, we've had 2 reviews, the Lamy and Laming reports, which have identified minority groups. And if we keep thinking in terms of one size fits all and assuming that every child is the same, we are then lacking the information about how different groups, minority groups within the cohort, might respond differently to things. So this is an example of some things that we really do need to know if we're going to have a more holistic youth justice system. By focusing the research on looking at these gaps and identifying minority groups by using a more refined methodology, I think that this is going to allow us to enable essentially to have a more holistic and more responsive system. So my research, I'm very determined that it's not going to be about predicting offending behaviour or about net widening. Rather, the project that I'm doing, and I'm doing this with Anthony, has been designed to understand how we can support children that have, once they've entered the system, and we can identify ways in which they need support. The data on its own will flag where there's a deviation from the curve. But we need to look beyond that and understand how it is that children and young people need to be supported. So in terms of, we could just move on to the last slide, and before we move on to Anthony, I think that there's some really, I obviously am very biased, but I think that my research has got a huge potential to help us. And I think more generally, data has got a huge potential to help us, particularly in those issues that are just below the surface, in terms of looking at new threats and emerging trends. So we can gather a lot of intelligence through surveillance. So that is about monitoring data. And with that, it's about perhaps looking not necessarily for the headline information, but looking at things where perhaps they're a bit odd or a bit different. Most of us come from a world where we're having to think about surveillance and the gathering of intelligence. So responsibility for gathering information about trends and intelligence tends to fall on the analyst. However, it's really important that we join the dots between what practitioners are hearing or observing, and crucially, what children are saying. So I'm quite happy to concede that administrative data can only take us so far. If we want to be asking the right questions in order for us to be able to support children and young people as they navigate what can be a very difficult system, then we actually need to be asking children about their views and to listen to their feedback about the system so we can find out what we can be doing differently. And this is something that Anthony and I are working on together as part of my current research. So I'll hand you over to Anthony now.
Brilliant, thanks, Helen. For those of you who aren't familiar with Bayes, neither was I to begin with. Let me just say that. And I come from a very different position, as probably this morning's talk and other talks of individuals have shown. I'm very much a qualitative research with a very big focus upon participatory methodologies. So you're probably thinking, how on earth do we marry these two things together? And actually going to something I said this morning, when we look at common visions, actually, it's quite straightforward. It's just about talking to children and seeing what data we need to use, what data we need to collect to understand what's going on in their lives. So I just wanted to give a quick sort of context around what we are doing, and then perhaps we can just give you a few more details and have a chat around it if there's any questions. First of all, we've got to look at Article 12. Article 12, in my opinion, and certainly when I've been talking to children, is probably one of the best but most misunderstood articles of the CRC. And us as adults, I can say that, we tend to like these mechanistic bodies and structures to give children an alleged voice. But it's still within that power dynamic, particularly within the criminal justice system. It's controlled. When we even look at things around early intervention prevention, it tends to focus on certain factors that we as adults have thought are important. And Does it always do what is just and actually about participation? Well, no. And these are all the views of children. So what we've tried to do, and this is where this project has come together, we're uniting participation and Bayes, is asking the questions at the bottom of the screen there. What's participation mean in a broader sense? How do we get, as well, adults and children to participate with each other so we can have a proper dialogue? Why does it matter, and how can we make services better? And what we've done is to work on an assumption that we don't really get participation. This is a bit of a throwback for me, going back to my own doctoral thesis and research I did. And that big wheel I put thinking, what on earth is that? That actually was designed by young people. And what they said was, their participation was something that was so innate, so powerful, so important, and was about, they wanted, for participation to be something that was worthy and seen in that way. It was about them wanting to do something, engaging, communicating with others, creating relationships, and actually being about the everyday things that have a significant impact upon their lives. Now, that sort of process, that sort of paradigm doesn't sit really well when we look at processual participation. And for me, the important thing is that we're really missing a trick. Because if we do take the views of children about, these are the things that matter, these are the things I'm worried about, these are the things that I want to have supported, or service interventions, then we move into a completely different way of working. And what we've also done is to take the assumptions, very sort of new sociology of childhood, I'm unashamed in saying that, where we say, actually, let's turn some things on their head, particularly when we look at research. So we've looked at positive outcomes that have been co-produced and come through things like pro-participatory models. I've only put this here, a couple of examples from research I've done, something called the You Community Project, working with children in one of our secondary schools. And what they did was to try and reset what their needs were, to say, actually, what the local authority was saying is wrong, what's happening in terms of community resources, it's wrong, this, excuse me, this is what actually needs to happen. And some really good examples there were when they would talk about things like health policy. So if you remember a little way back, the Jamie Oliver type thing, you shouldn't eat chips, you shouldn't have pizza, you shouldn't know. They say, actually, yeah, that's one little aspect. Part of it's about healthy images of children, the way people see themselves, the way peer pressure impacts them, the way the media is much greater, much more nuanced, and the way local communities operated and their place within that. Again, taking a very pro-rights, pro-citizenship approach. And when we also look at research around schools partnerships, and this is where the crux of some of what I'm going to talk about in a second came from, the children were saying, actually, we've got to question all the processes that are currently in place because they're not fit for purpose. So, one thing, for example, that we've done with children in school is to redesign behaviour policies, not discipline policies. Children say, not about that, but the way you regulate behaviour, the way restorative practice works, the way substance use is dealt with, to try and smash apart those sort of adult implications, adult assumptions. And instead, what we've come up with is this model led by the children, reintegrative participation or integrative participation, depending which way you look at it, if they're in the system or they're not, where they're saying, actually, for us to participate, we need to have adults working with us, like an apprenticeship. The formal process, yeah, played a part. If you ask most children in schools, what's the school council do? Well, there's a meeting once a month or something. Do they talk to their peers, though, and talk to teachers and talk to others and get decisions made? Yes. So where's the priority? There were then issues around the way learning spaces are used and the community is used, the way individuals grow. And all of these things we've sort of plotted out with the support of children, say, actually, this is far more powerful than something that can be reduced to a policy decision or policy process. And it ultimately has impacts upon, that should be strategy, management, not strategic management, on strategy and the way services are managed. So in terms of what we've been trying to do here is look at an alternative. And it's been building on the way rights respect in schools works. So again, going back to something I said earlier today, we see the convention as a whole. There's a reason that there are provisions within the convention to make sure that children have certain services, because in the absence of those services, we may create need. And we've got to remember as well, the convention generally requires adults and state parties, which is adults mainly, to provide these things for children. They shouldn't be begging for services. They shouldn't be begging for support. That should be provided as of right. And in order for something to be provided that's as of right and also important and properly aligned, voice matters. So this is intrinsically about a partnership. One thing I found that's really interesting, I sort of touched on this earlier today, but I'm going to raise it now because, again, something Helen and I are contributing to. It's really interesting in Wales, the Welsh Government is amending the way it's designing policy and service frameworks, in that it's adopting something called evaluability, put my teeth in, processes. So not just saying, these are the indicators, youth justice, for instance, that we want to do. How can you justify that? Is there academic literature behind that? What do children say? What do stakeholders say before the framework is established? I think that's incredibly powerful. I reflected, having worked with yachts for a very long time, I wonder what children would have said about the risk factor paradigm. That would be a fascinating piece of work if they ever understood it, because most adults don't really understand it. It'd be interesting to see whether they thought that was a sensible way to move forward. And so what we've done together in partnership is develop something called the Schools Data Linkage Project. And that's really the crux of where we are today. That project flowed from the way that we co-produce a new behaviour code in school. And that behaviour code in a particular school, what it did was to bring together a range of really progressive elements to create a new way of working. What it did, in a nutshell, in 1 year of operation, where the children completely ripped apart the discipline process and had instead a sort of pro-positive behaviour process, school exclusions fell by 68% in 1 year, at a time when the national figures were going up. Foundation phase indicator and core subject indicator attainment rose as well. So did anecdotal reporting of children being happier, all couched within a rights framework and in a restorative practice framework as well. And from that, we listened to the children. And what we are doing at the moment is working with one of the governing bodies, senior management in the school and with the children, to bring together the hard data, case data if you like, Helen will correct me if I'm wrong with this, hard data, and there's lots of it in schools, but to contextualize it in terms of what are children's priorities? What does that data actually tell us? How does that data respond to what children have identified as critical? And you might think, well, doesn't the data do that already? I think it does. Data at the moment, if we look at inspection reports and what government requires, a lot of data focuses upon targets. What we are trying to do is say, yes, you can have that data. You can look at those metrics, but there's something more powerful happening here. For instance, if we look at early intervention and prevention, if, for instance, a child has been referred for ALN, also used to be called SEN, and the local authority hasn't got capacity to process that in a certain timescale, that appears in this new approach. It would appear as a concern, not a risk. Let me be clear on that language, a concern that teachers then could work with, where appropriate interventions, for example, from social services, are not being followed up. Again, it appears. So what it does is a few things. It enables children's aspirations to be met. It empowers the school to respond positively to the children and actually becomes a tool for better service provision that looks at welfare, respects those rights, where the services aren't appearing, they can be deployed, and overall is intended to create a more positive use of data in the school, better management of the school, better support, better rights realisation. And so as we're moving forward with this, I'm not going to labour the point, we can have a chat then. You know, what we've got here is Helen is working on uniting these various data sets so we can have a unified dashboard, if I want to call it that. The school council will be involved in that, as will teachers, and some additional training will be provided to the schools so they can become more sophisticated in their use of this data process, which is actually really simple in application. We're still going to couch this in terms of a university and school partnership, so we can continue that development. If it works, we can continue and hopefully support our local authority as well. If this works, the Bayesian approach works, let's roll it out. It becomes more dynamic. It also means as well that in terms of our aspirations to have rights respect in schools, I call them right embedding schools these days because they respect it. Now it's about embedding it. That becomes stronger, particularly in relation to early intervention and prevention. I'm going to sound a bit cliche here, but you know, if we catch problems early, we know that people can be supported, families and children, and hopefully we can avoid negative engagement with the system. And the last point I will make here is it's all as well about dual participation. Takes that concept and moves it slightly. The data allows us to do that. So we go that next step. We go article 12.1, 12.2. It's almost article 12.3 here, which is not about adults listening, but they have to work in partnership with the children. So there's this dialogical approach. So the children involved, the staff are involved, and of course, because the children involved, their families are also. So what we are trying to do is bring together far more complex statistical approaches, analytical approaches, contextualize them and focus them. So a few quick reflections from me, and then we'll go over, we just check what time it is. Yeah, we got over now then to the chat. What's it mean? We've got to change our assumptions and the methods. I am a qualitative researcher mainly, and some people get very frightened by quantitative methods. One of the things I've learned in this, and I do see myself very much as a learner in this process as well, is that actually by not creating robust hybrid approaches, which are actually asked for by the people it most affects, we're missing a trick. Next, in terms of why does all of this matter? It matters because it can empower children, because they get to change the way schools respond and behave. But it also helps teachers and decision makers, not just at school level, but this will flow upwards into the local education authority, could flow up to the Welsh Parliament and the Welsh Government. There's a critical mass here of potential that we need to unlock. And then finally, how does it make services better? Well, I've alluded to some of this already, but it means that innovation, hearing and listening become part of that process. It's not just about delivery. It's about a proper conceptualization. It's about evidence, but it's also about, again, the needs and not necessarily just the needs of the children. We will leave this slide up, but I think if we put this up at the end, Helen, should we go into sort of a whole room now?
Yeah, I think really we'll be showing the slides afterwards, but as you can see, Anthony and I come from, as I said, almost like opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the qual-quant kind of methods approach. We've given an example from my postdoc where Anthony is supporting me, and then Anthony's given an example of where I am supporting him in his work. But if you do want to ask us any questions, feel free to email us, and we've also put our Twitter handles on that slide for you to look at them. I think if I stop the recording now and we can open things up to discussion. He's given an example of where I am supporting him in his work. But if you do want to ask us any questions, feel free to email us, and we've also put our Twitter handles on that slide for you to look at them. I think if I stop the recording now and we can open things up to discussion.